The first scream that pierced the dawn air over the kingdom of Ethermore would haunt Princess Seraphina Valdris for the rest of her days. She stood on the marble balcony of her tower, watching the morning mist curl around the cobblestone streets below, when the sound shattered the peaceful silence like glass against stone. It wasn't the scream of pain or fear she might have expected from a marketplace accident or common street brawl. This was something primal, something that spoke of terror beyond human comprehension. Seraphina's emerald eyes narrowed as she leaned forward, her auburn hair catching the early sunlight. Below in the lower district, she could see figures stumbling through the narrow alleyways with an unnatural, jerking gait. At first, she assumed them to be drunken revelers from the harvest festival that had concluded the night before. But as her gaze focused, ice formed in her veins. These weren't celebrants sleeping off their wine. These were her people, but wrong in every conceivable way. Their clothes were torn and blood-stained, their skin an unnatural gray pallor. They moved with purposeless hunger, converging on anything that breathed with a relentless, mindless determination. When one of them turned toward her tower, Seraphina saw what had once been Baker Aldwin's kind face now twisted into something monstrous, his eyes clouded white, his mouth hanging open to reveal teeth stained crimson. "Your Highness." The urgent voice of Captain Theron Blackveil echoed from behind her as he burst through the chamber doors, his usually pristine armor bearing fresh scratches and dark stains. His weathered face, normally composed even in the gravest situations, was etched with barely controlled panic. "You must come with me immediately. The kingdom is under attack, but not by any enemy we've ever faced." Seraphina turned from the balcony, her silk nightgown billowing around her slender frame. At 19, she had been raised to face political intrigue, economic crisis, and even conventional warfare, but nothing in her royal education had prepared her for this. "Captain, what's happening to our people? They look like the dead, Your Highness." "They look like the dead because that's what they are." Theron's voice was grim as he approached, his hand resting on his sword hilt. 3 hours ago, reports began flooding in from every district. People who had died yesterday, last week, even months ago, rising from their graves and attacking the living. Those they bite or scratch soon die from their wounds, only to rise again within minutes. The princess felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She had heard whispers from traveling merchants about strange plagues in distant lands, stories dismissed as superstition and tavern tales. But here, in her own kingdom, the impossible was unfolding before her eyes. "My father?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "King Alderic is safe for now, barricaded in the great hall with what remains of the royal guard." But Seraphina, Theron's use of her given name rather than her title spoke to the gravity of the situation. "The outer walls have been breached. The city is falling faster than we can mount any defense. These creatures feel no pain, show no fear, and their numbers grow with every person they claim." Through the balcony doors, the sounds of chaos grew louder. Screams echoed through the streets, mixing with an otherworldly moaning that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The acrid smell of smoke began to drift upward as fires broke out across the city, whether from overturned lamps or desperate attempts to create barriers against the undead horde. Seraphina straightened her shoulders, drawing upon the strength that had been bred into her bloodline for generations. The Valdris family had ruled Ethermore for 3 centuries, weathering wars, famines, and political upheavals through sheer determination and an unbreakable spirit that refused to yield to despair. "Then we fight," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her heart. "Gather whatever weapons you can find in my chambers. If our kingdom is to fall, it won't be because its princess cowered in her tower while her people faced the darkness alone. The corridors of Castle Ethermore had become a labyrinth of horror within hours of the first outbreak. Seraphina moved through passages she had known since childhood, now transformed into battlegrounds where tapestries hung in tatters and ancient stone was splattered with blood. Beside her, Captain Theron led a small group of surviving guards, their formation tight and weapons drawn as they navigated toward the great hall where her father had reportedly made his stand. The princess had shed her silk nightgown for practical leather armor borrowed from a fallen guard, the weight unfamiliar but oddly comforting against her frame. In her hand, she clutched her grandfather's ceremonial sword, its blade now christened with the dark ichor that flowed from the undead. She had discovered, to her horror and relief, that severing the head or destroying the brain seemed to permanently stop the creatures, though the knowledge came at the cost of watching her childhood tutor, Scholar Matthias Grimhart, demonstrate this grim reality when he was forced to end his own assistant's unnatural resurrection. "The East Wing is completely overrun," whispered Guard Sergeant Rowan Stormridge, his young face pale but determined. "I saw Lady Celestine leading a group of servants toward the wine cellars. They might be safe there for now." Lysandra Nightweave, the court's chief mage and Seraphina's closest confidant, moved beside them with silent grace. Her usually pristine silver robes were singed and torn, evidence of the magical fires she had been forced to conjure against the undead tide. "The wards I placed around the great hall should hold for some time," she murmured, her violet eyes scanning the shadows ahead. "But I can sense something disturbing about this plague. It's not natural decay or simple necromancy. There's an intelligence behind it, something that feeds on the life force itself." As they rounded the final corner before the great hall, Seraphina's heart sank. The massive oak doors, reinforced with iron bands and bearing the royal crest of Ethermore, hung splintered and askew. Through the gaps, she could see overturned furniture and the bodies of guards who had made their final stand protecting their king. The silence was more terrifying than any sound of battle could have been. "Father," she whispered, pushing past Theron's protective arm to rush toward the entrance. Inside the great hall, King Alderic Valdris sat slumped upon his throne, his crown askew and his royal robes torn. For a moment, hope flared in Seraphina's chest as she saw his chest rising and falling with breath. But as she approached, she noticed the savage bite marks along his arms and the unnatural pallor creeping up his neck. "Seraphina, my brave daughter," he said, his voice weak but still carrying the authority that had commanded respect throughout the realm. "I hoped you had escaped. This plague, this curse, it comes from beyond our borders, but it may have found purchase here because of our own sins." "Don't speak of sins, Father. We'll find a way to cure this, to restore our kingdom." Seraphina knelt beside the throne, taking his cold hand in hers. But even as she spoke, she could see the light fading from his eyes, replaced by something hungry and alien. King Alderic's grip suddenly tightened with inhuman strength. "You must leave this place. Find Kaelin Ashworth in the northern reaches. He leads those who have learned to survive this plague. Only through unity of the living can you hope to. His voice trailed off as his breathing stopped entirely. For a heartbeat, the hall was silent. Then, with a low moan that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself, the king's eyes snapped open, now clouded white with undead hunger. His fingers, still grasping his daughter's hand, began to tighten with the intent to drag her close enough for teeth that now gleamed with predatory intent. Captain Theron's sword descended in a silver arc, separating the reanimated king's head from his shoulders before Seraphina could fully process what was happening. The body slumped back into the throne, truly lifeless now, while the princess stared in shock at the man who had just saved her life by ending her father's. "I'm sorry, Your Highness," Theron said softly, his sword trembling in his grip. "But he was no longer the king we served." Seraphina rose slowly, her face etched with grief but her spine straight with newfound resolve. Around them, the sounds of the growing undead horde echoed through the castle halls. The kingdom of Ethermore had fallen, but its princess still lived, and with her, the hope of reclaiming what had been lost to the darkness. The underground passages beneath Castle Ethermore had been forgotten by most of the court, known only to a few scholars and the occasional curious princess who had spent her childhood exploring every hidden corner of her ancestral home. Now, these dusty tunnels served as the lifeline that allowed Serafina and her small band of survivors to escape the fallen castle undetected by the shambling hordes above. Their group had grown during the harrowing flight through the castle. Lady Celestine Brightmere had emerged from the wine cellars with a dozen servants and kitchen staff, while scholar Matthias Grimhart had rescued several apprentices from the burning library. Most surprising of all was the appearance of Mira Thornfield, a 16-year-old stable girl who had somehow managed to survive the initial outbreak by barricading herself in the grain loft with nothing but her wits and a pitchfork. As they emerged from the tunnel entrance hidden among the roots of an ancient oak tree, the devastation of their kingdom spread before them like a nightmare landscape. Smoke rose from dozens of fires throughout the city, while the undead wandered the streets in growing numbers. The beautiful capital that had been known throughout the realm for its golden spires and flowering gardens now resembled a charnel house under the grey morning sky. "We can't stay here," Lysandra said, her magical senses allowing her to detect the approaching undead before the others could see them. The horde grows stronger with each passing hour, and they seem drawn to large groups of the living. Serafina surveyed their band of survivors, counting 23 souls who looked to her for guidance despite having lost everything they had ever known. The weight of leadership pressed down upon her shoulders, but she remembered her father's final words about Kaelin Ashworth and the northern reaches. "Scholar Grimhart," she called to the elderly man who was tending to a wounded guard. "What do you know of this plague? My father suggested it came from beyond our borders." The scholar's weathered face creased with concentration as he continued bandaging the guard's injuries. "I've been studying the ancient texts during our flight, Your Highness. There are references to similar outbreaks in the historical records, always preceded by reports of a crimson comet crossing the night sky. The texts speak of a corruption that spreads not just through bite and scratch, but through some deeper contamination of the earth itself." "A comet?" Captain Theron frowned, cleaning his blood-stained sword. "I remember the astronomers speaking of unusual celestial events in recent weeks, but I paid little attention to their scholarly concerns." Mira Thornfield, who had been quietly listening while keeping watch on their perimeter, suddenly spoke up. "I saw it 3 nights ago. A red star that moved across the sky like a bleeding wound. My grandmother used to tell stories about such things, warnings passed down from her grandmother about times when the dead would walk and the living would need to find sanctuary in high places." Lysandra's violet eyes widened with sudden understanding. "Not just high places, but places of power. The ancient sites where the old magic still flows strong. If this corruption comes from beyond our world, then perhaps the old protections still hold some strength against it." Serafina made her decision with the swift certainty that had been drilled into her through years of royal training. "Then we head north to find Kaelin Ashworth. If he's managed to organize resistance against this plague, he'll need every sword and every piece of knowledge we can bring." She turned to address the entire group, her voice carrying across their small camp with the authority inherited from generations of rulers. "I won't lie to you about what we face. Our kingdom has fallen, our friends and families are lost to us, and the road ahead promises only hardship and danger. But we are not merely refugees fleeing in panic. We are the remnant of Ethermore, and we carry with us the hope of reclaiming our homeland from this darkness." Scholar Grimhart approached her, carrying a leather satchel filled with ancient texts and scrolls. "Your Highness, before we depart, there's something else you should know. According to these records, the previous outbreaks were eventually contained, but only through great sacrifice. The texts speak of a cleansing fire that could burn away the corruption, but the cost was always measured in the lives of those pure enough to kindle such a flame." The implication of his words hung heavy in the air as the group prepared to leave their hiding place. Serafina understood that her journey north would be more than a simple quest for survival or even the gathering of resistance forces. If the ancient knowledge proved true, she might be walking toward a destiny that would demand everything she had to give, including her life, to save what remained of her world. As they set out across the devastated landscape, the princess looked back once at her fallen kingdom, memorizing the sight of home before turning her face toward the uncertain road ahead. The northern reaches had always been a wild and unforgiving landscape, where hardy mountain folk carved out their existence from rocky soil and harsh winters. Now, 3 weeks after fleeing their fallen kingdom, Seraphina and her band of survivors discovered that these remote settlements had become something far more significant, islands of civilization in a sea of undead horror. Kaelin Ashworth proved to be nothing like what Seraphina had expected from her father's brief description. Where she had anticipated perhaps a grizzled mountain lord or battle-scarred veteran, she found instead a scholarly young man barely older than herself, with keen gray eyes and hands more suited to handling books than weapons. His stronghold, built into the natural caves of Mount Silver Peak, housed nearly 300 survivors from across the northern territories. "Your Highness," Kaelin said, offering a respectful bow as she entered his makeshift command center deep within the mountain fortress. "Your father spoke truly when he said you possessed an unbreakable spirit. The fact that you managed to lead your people safely through the infected lowlands speaks to remarkable courage." The cavern around them had been transformed into a hub of desperate activity. Maps covered every available surface, marked with red symbols indicating undead concentrations and green markers showing confirmed survivor enclaves. Groups of men and women worked at tables scattered throughout the space, some fletching arrows while others ground herbs and minerals under Lysandra's careful supervision. "We've learned much about our enemy in the weeks since the outbreak began," Kaelin continued, leading Seraphina to a large table where Scholar Grimheart was already deep in conversation with several northern wise women. "The infection spreads in patterns that suggest intelligence rather than random plague. The undead move in coordinated waves, always seeking to isolate and overwhelm survivor groups before they can organize effective resistance." Mira Thornfield, who had proven surprisingly adept at scouting and reconnaissance during their journey north, approached with a grim expression. "The lowland settlements are completely lost, Your Highness. I managed to get close enough to Millhaven to see that the entire population has turned. But there's something else, something worse." She gestured toward a crude map she had sketched on bark parchment. "The undead aren't just wandering randomly. They're gathering at specific locations, old places marked by standing stones and ancient burial grounds. It's like they're drawn to sites where the boundary between life and death was always thin." Scholar Grimheart looked up from an ancient tome bound in cracked leather, his face pale with discovery. "The young scout's observations confirm what I've found in these northern chronicles. The corruption doesn't just reanimate the dead, it seeks to tear open permanent gateways between our world and whatever realm spawned this plague. If enough undead gather at these focal points during the next dark moon, the barrier between worlds could collapse entirely," Lysandra finished, her magical senses having detected the growing wrongness in the very air around them. "We would face not just the walking dead of our own realm, but an endless tide of horrors from beyond." Kaelin's expression grew even more grave as he pointed to a detailed map of the region. "We've identified 7 such gathering points within 100 leagues of here. 5 have already fallen dark, with massive undead congregations forming around them. But 2 remain contested, the ancient temple complex at Raven's Hollow and the Great Stone Circle at Moonfall Vale." Seraphina studied the maps with the strategic mind her tutors had spent years developing. The situation was desperate beyond imagination, but she could see the glimmer of a possible solution forming in the patterns before them. If these gateways must be opened simultaneously to complete whatever ritual the plague seeks to accomplish, then disrupting even one might be enough to prevent the greater catastrophe. "True, but the cost would be enormous," Kaelin replied. "Our scouts report that thousands of undead guard each remaining site. A direct assault would be suicide, even with every survivor we could possibly muster." "Not a direct assault," Seraphina said slowly, her mind working through the implications of what Scholar Grimheart had discovered about the ancient texts. "A sacrifice. The cleansing fire mentioned in the old records. If someone pure enough could reach the heart of a gateway site and kindle that flame." The cavern fell silent as the full meaning of her words sank in. Captain Theron stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. Your Highness, surely there must be another way. The realm has already lost too much to consider such a course. Lysandra, however, was nodding slowly as understanding dawned in her violet eyes. The cleansing fire isn't simply a weapon, is it? It's a transformation, a willing sacrifice that turns one's life force into pure energy capable of burning away the corruption itself. But the price? The price is everything, Seraphina said quietly, looking around at the faces of those who had followed her through the worst catastrophe their world had ever known. But if that's what it takes to save what remains of our world, then it's a price worth paying. The preparation for what might be their final battle consumed the mountain stronghold with desperate intensity. Every smith worked around the clock to forge weapons and arrowheads from blessed silver, while Lysandra and the other magic users exhausted themselves creating protective wards and enchantments. The plan they had developed was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications, a three-pronged assault that would divide their limited forces to simultaneously threaten both remaining gateway sites while concealing the true objective. Seraphina stood in the highest chamber of Mount Silver Peak, watching the valley below where their scouts reported the undead masses growing larger each day. The dark moon was only 3 nights away, and with it would come the culmination of whatever cosmic horror had been set in motion by the Crimson Comet's passage. She wore her grandfather's armor now, polished to a mirror shine and inscribed with protective runes that Lysandra had painstakingly carved into every piece. The northern wise women have completed their preparations, Kalen reported as he entered the chamber, his own gear bearing the practical marks of a man who had learned to fight for survival rather than glory. They've created enough of the blessed oil to coat our weapons and arrows for the assault. But Seraphina. He paused, using her given name in the informal way that had developed between them during the planning sessions. Are you certain this is the only way? The princess turned from the window, her emerald eyes reflecting both determination and the weight of impending sacrifice. Scholar Grimheart has been quite thorough in his research. Every historical account of these plaques ending successfully mentions the cleansing fire, and in every case, it required someone of royal blood to kindle the flame. My father understood this when he sent me to find you. He knew what would ultimately be required. Captain Theron entered behind Kalen, followed by Mira Thornfield and several of the expedition leaders who would guide the diversionary forces. The young stable girl had transformed during their time in the mountains, her natural courage and quick thinking earning her a place among the tactical planners despite her humble origins. The southern force is ready to move on Raven's Hollow, Theron announced, his weathered face showing the strain of preparing for what they all knew would likely be a suicide mission. 200 volunteers, the best fighters we have. They'll create enough distraction to draw significant numbers away from Moonfall Vale. And the northern force? Seraphina asked, though she already knew the answer. Another 150, led by Lysandra herself, Mira replied. They'll assault the outer defenses of Moonfall Vale, making it appear that we're attempting to overwhelm the site through sheer force. Meanwhile, I'll take a small team through the hidden passages that the wise women showed us, Seraphina finished. 30 of our most skilled infiltrators, carrying the materials needed to reach the central stone circle and kindle the cleansing fire. Scholar Grimheart shuffled into the chamber, his arms full of ancient scrolls and his face bearing the exhaustion of days spent in intensive research. Your Highness, I've made one final discovery that you must know before tomorrow's assault. The cleansing fire doesn't simply destroy the local corruption. If successfully kindled at the right moment, during the convergence itself, it will create a wave of purification that can reach across vast distances. He spread his most precious scroll across the strategy table, revealing illustrations of previous cleansing rituals surrounded by text in the old tongue. The fire burns outward from its source, following the same mystical connections that the corruption uses to spread. One successful cleansing fire, set at the moment when all gateways are most vulnerable, could potentially purify the entire region and seal the barriers between worlds permanently. The implications of this revelation transformed the very nature of their mission. They weren't simply attempting to disrupt one gateway site to prevent immediate catastrophe, they were positioning themselves to potentially end the plague entirely and reclaim their lost kingdom. Then we're not just fighting for survival anymore, Kalen said, his voice carrying new hope despite the enormity of the challenge before them. We're fighting for restoration, for the chance to rebuild everything we've lost. Seraphina nodded, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a royal mantle. Tomorrow, we ride to determine the fate of our world. Whatever the cost, whatever the sacrifice required, we will see this darkness ended and our lands restored to the light. As night fell over the mountain stronghold, the princess spent her final evening among her people, sharing stories and memories of the kingdom they hoped to restore. She knew that by the next sunset, she would either be dead or transformed beyond recognition by the cleansing fire. But as she looked into the faces of those who had followed her through the worst of times, she felt only peace with the choice she had made. The assault on Moonfall Vale began before dawn with the thunderous sound of war horns echoing across the corrupted landscape. Seraphina watched from her concealed position in the ancient burial caves as Captain Theron's southern force engaged the undead hordes at Raven's Hollow, drawing thousands of the creatures away from their primary target. Even at this distance, she could see the brilliant flashes of Lyssandra's battle magic as the northern force began their faint assault on the outer defenses of the stone circle. The Vale itself had been transformed into a nightmare landscape over the past weeks. Where once green meadows had surrounded the ancient standing stones, now the ground was cracked and blackened, seeping with an oily substance that reeked of decay. The stones themselves pulsed with an unholy crimson light, and the air above them writhed with shadows that seemed to move independently of any earthly source. "The convergence has already begun," whispered Brother Aldwin, one of the mountain priests who had volunteered for this most dangerous mission. "The barriers between worlds grow thin. We can feel it in our very bones." Seraphina's infiltration team had been reduced to its essential core: herself, Mira Thornfield, two of Kalen's best mountain fighters, and Brother Aldwin to perform the ritual components that only a trained cleric could complete. They carried with them the accumulated knowledge of ages, distilled into practical components: vials of sanctified oil, silver implements carved with protective runes, and most importantly, the ancient chalice that would focus the cleansing fire once it was kindled. "The way is clear," Mira reported, returning from her scouting position at the cave mouth. "Most of the undead have moved toward the diversionary attacks, but there are still hundreds guarding the inner circle. And Your Highness." She paused, her young face troubled. "There's something else at the center of the stones. Something that isn't quite undead, but isn't alive either." They moved through the burial tunnels with careful precision, following passages that had been carved by the original builders of the stone circle millennia ago. The wise women had shared legends of these hidden approaches, used by ancient priests to reach the sacred sites during times of war or plague. The irony wasn't lost on Seraphina that she was following the same paths taken by others who had faced similar darkness in ages past. When they finally emerged within the stone circle itself, the sight that greeted them defied all earthly reason. The massive standing stones, each taller than 3 men, formed a perfect ring around a central altar that pulsed with malevolent energy. Hovering above the altar was a tear in reality itself, through which glimpses of a nightmarish realm could be seen. And standing before the tear, directing the ritual energies with gestures that seemed to bend space around them, was a figure that had once been human but was now something far more terrible. "The Herald," Brother Aldwin breathed, recognition dawning in his eyes. "The texts speak of one who would serve as anchor between the worlds, neither fully alive nor dead, but sustained by the corruption itself." The Herald turned at their approach, and Seraphina saw a face that might have once belonged to a scholar or priest, now twisted by power that no mortal form was meant to contain. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from the tear itself rather than any throat. "So, the little princess comes to play at heroism. Do you comprehend what you seek to undo? The barriers between worlds were never meant to be permanent. We offer reunion with all those you have lost, eternal existence beyond the constraints of mortality." Seraphina drew her grandfather's sword, its blessed silver blade gleaming with its own inner light as it sensed the corruption surrounding them. "I've seen what your reunions offer. They're not life, they're not even death. They're just endless hunger wearing the faces of those we loved. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the histories of warfare. The herald wielded the very fabric of reality as a weapon, tearing openings in space through which horrors from beyond poured to defend their anchor point. Seraphina's small team fought with desperate courage, each of them knowing that failure meant not just their own destruction, but the end of their world as they knew it. Mira Thornfield proved herself a true daughter of Ethermore, her humble origins forgotten as she moved with deadly grace to protect the princess's flanks. The mountain fighters carved through undead reinforcements with weapons blessed by ancient rites, while Brother Aldwin began the complex ritual that would prepare the altar for the cleansing fire. As the battle reached its crescendo, Seraphina found herself face to face with the herald at the very edge of the dimensional tear. The creature's corrupted power was overwhelming, but in that moment, she felt the spirits of all those she had lost flowing through her, her father's strength, Scholar Grimheart's wisdom, the courage of every fallen defender of Ethermore. "Now, Your Highness," Brother Aldwin called out as he completed the final preparations. "The chalice stands ready." Seraphina knew what was required. The cleansing fire could only be kindled by the willing sacrifice of one pure of heart and royal of blood. As she raised the ancient chalice and spoke the words of power that Brother Aldwin had taught her, she felt her life force beginning to transform into something far greater than mere mortality could contain. The cleansing fire that erupted from Princess Seraphina Valdris burned with a light that seemed to contain the essence of every star in the night sky. It poured forth from the ancient chalice like liquid starlight, consuming the herald's corrupted form and sealing the dimensional tear with a sound like reality itself sighing in relief. The wave of purification spread outward from Moonfall Vale in ever-widening circles, washing over the corrupted landscape and transforming it back to the green and living earth it had once been. Mira Thornfield watched in awe and terror as her princess became something more than human in those final moments. Seraphina's mortal form dissolved into pure energy, but her consciousness remained, directing the cleansing fire with a will that refused to be extinguished even by transformation into living flame. The young stable girl would later struggle to find words for what she witnessed, a soul so strong that it could burn away the darkness of an entire realm while maintaining its essential self. Across the region, the effects of the cleansing fire manifested as a gentle dawn that seemed to rise from the earth itself rather than the sky. The undead hordes that had terrorized the land for weeks simply crumbled to dust, their unnatural animation severed from the source that had sustained it. In the ruins of Ethermore's capital, flowers began to bloom among the rubble, and the acrid smoke of corruption was replaced by the sweet scent of new growth. Captain Theron felt the wave pass over his position at Raven's Hollow, watching in amazement as his undead opponent simply ceased to exist, leaving him and his battered force standing among fields that sparkled with morning dew rather than the blood and ichor that had soaked them moments before. He raised his sword toward Moonfall Vale in silent salute to the princess who had given everything to achieve this miracle. Lysandra, leading the Northern Diversionary Force, felt the cleansing fire pass through her own magical senses like a warm wind carrying the promise of spring after the harshest winter. The raw magic of the event was so pure, so fundamentally right, that she wept openly as she realized what Seraphina had accomplished. The realm was saved, but at a cost that would echo through the generations to come. Kaelan Ashworth arrived at Moonfall Vale as the last echoes of the cleansing fire faded into ordinary daylight. He found the stone circle restored to its ancient serenity, the blackened earth now covered with grass and wildflowers. At the center, where the altar had stood, there remained only a small pool of crystal-clear water that reflected the sky with perfect clarity. Mira Thornfield sat beside the pool, still in shock from what she had witnessed. "She's still here," the young woman said softly as Kaelan approached. "Not in any way we can see or touch, but she's here. The water, sometimes you can see her reflection instead of your own, and she's smiling." In the months that followed, the survivors of the plague worked together to rebuild their world. The kingdom of Ethermore was restored, but it was a different realm than it had been before, united by shared struggle and guided by the memory of a princess who had proved that some spirits truly were unbreakable. Kaelan was crowned as the new king, ruling with wisdom gained through hardship, while Mira was elevated to serve as his chief counselor, her humble origins forgotten in light of her proven courage. Scholar Grimheart established a new library dedicated to preserving the knowledge that had saved their world, ensuring that future generations would remember both the horror of the plague years and the sacrifice that ended them. The text spoke of Princess Seraphina not as a tragic figure, but as a guardian spirit who had willingly transformed herself into a permanent shield against the return of such darkness. Yet sometimes, on the clearest nights when the moon shone full over the restored kingdom, those who had known her swore they could see her walking the battlements of the rebuilt castle, still watching over her people as she had promised she always would. The pool at Moonfall Vale became a shrine where pilgrims came to seek guidance, and many claimed that in its crystal waters, they could glimpse the face of the brave princess who had given everything to ensure that the dead would remain at rest and the living could build a future worthy of such sacrifice. The kingdom of Ethermore thrived in the years that followed, but its people never forgot that their peace had been purchased with the life of their princess. Her story became legend, passed down through generations as a reminder that true nobility lay not in titles or crowns, but in the willingness to sacrifice everything for those you were sworn to protect. And in the gentle light that seemed to bless their harvests and warm their winters, they felt the continued presence of an unbreakable spirit that had chosen love over life, and in doing so, had saved them all.